Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for you to hear. It begins in the Appalachian backwoods in the year 1908, inside a forgotten place called the Peddlers Inn, an inn that swallowed strangers whole. They came with wagons, with coins jingling in their pockets, with hope of shelter for the night. And yet, many never left. Their names erased, their belongings scattered, their bones hidden. Now, before we descend deeper, I want you to pause. I want you to feel the weight of this truth. For over a century, whispers of this inn have spread like disease through the valleys of Tennessee, muttered around firelight, written in police ledgers, and buried in newspaper archives. It's a story authorities tried to dismiss as rumor, but rumors don't leave skeletons beneath floorboards. Tell me in the comments right now, where are you watching from? Because tonight, you and I are entering a forbidden story together. One that grips men with the question, how much of history was built on lies? How many stories were erased because they revealed too much about power, greed, and control? Picture the setting. The hills rolled dark and endless, thick forests pressing against narrow dirt roads. The world in 1908 was already shifting. Railroads stretched like veins, the last echoes of the Civil War still haunted men's eyes, and rural America clung to survival through trade, barter, and trust in strangers passing through. A peddler could carry everything he owned in a satchel. He was anonymous, disposable, perfect prey. And that is where the Peddlers Inn revealed its true purpose. To the passerby, it was nothing more than a modest rest stop, a slanted wooden sign, a warm fire inside, the kind of place a weary traveler would thank God for finding after a long day's journey. But the truth was darker. Some who crossed that threshold never crossed back into daylight. Their disappearance explained away as wanderers who moved on, convenient, unquestioned, forgotten. But here's where you must pay attention. This was not random crime. It wasn't just one innkeeper snapping under pressure. What the evidence suggests is a system, a pattern, a machine for eliminating the unwanted, silencing the nameless, and feeding something older than law. Think about it. How could so many vanish without consequence? How could generations of bones lie beneath the same roof and the town still go on as if nothing happened? Either the locals didn't see, or they chose not to see. And history, as you know, is always written by those who choose silence. But silence is the mask of power, because when ordinary men vanish, their stories vanish with them. And that's the secret. Sometimes a murder is not just a murder. Sometimes it is a cleansing, a ritual, a tool, a way of reminding the living who controls the soil beneath their feet. You were never meant to hear this, because if you did, if you understood what really happened in that little inn in 1908, you'd start asking questions about what else has been erased, about what other truths are buried under foundations we walk over every single day. So let me ask you, if a building could drink blood, if its wood and stone could remember screams, would you dare walk through its door? Because that's where our descent begins. With a girl named Debbie, a silver bracelet, and a note that lured her into a place where the past was waiting. The night the curse of the inn stirred again was July 7th, 1973. The Appalachian air was thick with the smell of rain, the kind of storm that rattles the bones of the mountains themselves. In Millerton, Tennessee, a girl named Debbie Lawson walked alone down a gravel road, denim jacket tight around her shoulders, humming to a song still playing faintly from her brother's Firebird. She was 16, filled with plans, with hope, with dreams bigger than her small town could hold. And yet, she was already walking toward her grave. At the end of the driveway she found it, a note tucked beneath a stone, the ink blurred slightly by humidity. Found your bracelet by the old inn. Come before dark to get it. The charm bracelet was gone from her wrist, a gift from her grandmother, a piece of her heart. She didn't hesitate. That's what innocence does. It walks willingly into the jaws of history. The Peddlers Inn had loomed on the horizon all her life, rotting but still standing. Children dared each other to go near, adults muttered its name in warnings, and old-timers recalled stories of travelers who checked in but never checked out. Most dismissed them as ghost tales, but legends do not form without a body beneath them. As Debbie approached, the sky bruised into storm. The sign hung from a single nail, the paint stripped by time. Inside, silence waited. The walls breathed mildew. The floorboards creaked with the weight of things long hidden. No one saw her cross the threshold. No one saw the door swing shut. By nightfall, she was gone. Her mother called the sheriff, panic quivering through the rotary phone. A storm broke, rain hammering the hills as flashlights carved through the trees in desperate search. Her name was called into the darkness. Echoes swallowed whole. At dawn, the deputy pried up the floorboards, and beneath them lay not just Debbie's body, her silver brace, let resting cold against her chest, but bones, too many bones, a hidden chamber of skulls, femurs, scraps of fabric, generations of the lost stacked together in silence. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was a crime scene spanning 70 years. But the story didn't end with discovery. It began again. Because once truth rises from the ground, it is never just bones. It is questions. Who had built this place into a slaughterhouse? Why had it been allowed to continue? And what did it serve beyond greed? The sheriff's men taped off the site, cameras flashed against the walls, but none of that could contain the shadow that had been unearthed. The townspeople gathered at the fence, staring at the inn like it was a living thing, a beast caught in the act of digesting. Mothers held their children closer. Men remembered whispers they had laughed off. And above it all, the storm broke again, lightning illuminating the inn's crooked windows like empty eyes. Debbie Lawson had walked into history's jaws, and in her death, she tore open a secret the mountains had been trying to hide for 7 decades. The question now was not whether the inn had been a site of murder. That was undeniable. The question was, why did so many vanish, and why had no one spoken the truth? And in that silence, in those unasked questions, lies the darkness we are about to uncover. The Peddlers' Inn was never simply a business. It was a mask, and behind that mask stood the Hadleys. Theodore Hadley bought the inn in 1902 when the region was little more than dirt roads, lumber mills and coal wagons rattling through the valleys. On paper he was just another landowner, a man trying to make a living by catering to the trickle of peddlers and travellers drifting south. His wife, Constance, was quiet, dutiful. Their son, Edward, was restless. His presence made locals uneasy even then. Theodore ran the inn for nearly 2 decades. He died in 1920, but by then the whispers had already begun. Peddlers disappearing, trunks of goods abandoned, wagons left to rot on the roadside, but no bodies, no blood, no evidence, just absence, men erased like chalk lines washed away by rain. When questioned, locals would lower their voices. Yes, there were rumors. Yes, the Hadleys were odd. But oddness is not proof. And in an era before forensic science, before missing persons databases, before the reach of federal law into small counties, disappearance was easy to disguise. If a traveler never reached his next town, who would come looking? What's chilling is this. Records show that Theodore filed multiple land expansions, acquiring parcels near the inn, often after debts were mysteriously settled. Men would arrive with goods, but Theodore would end up with their property, and still, no one asked too many questions. In rural America, power is not always in the form of money. It is in silence. Those who benefit look away. Those who fear consequences stay quiet. But the true rot of the Hadleys was not Theodore. It was Edward. By the accounts of those who remembered him, he was always there in the shadows, watching guests with an intensity that unsettled even the most hardened peddlers. He didn't work the inn in the open. He lurked. In 1973, when investigators read the remains under the floorboards, a retired handyman named Richard Turner finally spoke. He had worked for the Hadleys between 1911 and 1915. His testimony was thin with age, but clear. There was something not right about that boy, always hovering, always hungry for something you couldn't name. And here lies the first fork in our descent. Was Edward simply a violent, disturbed young man, killing for thrill, for dominance, for perverse pleasure? Or was the Hadley family operating as something more than innkeepers, something like gatekeepers, deciding which strangers would pass through the mountains and which would never leave? Because let's examine the evidence. Among the remains found beneath the inn were fragments of goods, watches, belt buckles, coins, items with real value. Were these murders simple theft, or were they sacrifices to something older than money? The peddlers were the perfect prey. They traveled alone. They were untraceable. Kill them, and no one in town would mourn. Hide their bones, and no one would investigate. It was a system of erasure, a pattern of power. And the Hadleys thrived under it. Theodore died a respected man. Constance faded into obscurity. Edward lived until 1968 in the same town where bones still lay beneath the inn. No one touched him. No one asked. So now we must face the darker possibility. The inn was not simply a site of crime. It was a tool, a carefully maintained trap, a mechanism that could run for decades, concealed not by skill, but by society's willingness not to see. And when Debbie Lawson vanished in 1973, when her death cracked open the floorboards and exposed the skeletons, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was history repeating itself. The shadow of the Hadleys reaching from the grave, reminding the town, and us, that corruption doesn't die. It waits. Silence. That is the truest currency of power. You see, it wasn't just the Hadleys who kept the Peddlers Inn alive. It was everyone who looked away. Think about it. In 1908, a traveller vanishes. His wagon left abandoned by the roadside. The town whispers, but no one confronts the innkeeper. Why? Because to confront is to risk. To confront is to challenge the structure that provides you with stability. Theodore Hadley was not wealthy, but he was rooted. He was a property owner. His family was known. The strangers who disappeared were not, and in that imbalance, silence flourished. This is the psychology of complicity. Communities do not ignore atrocities because they fail to notice. They ignore them because noticing would require action, and action is dangerous. A missing traveller? Better to say he moved on. Better to say he chose another road. Better to bury unease under the soil of superstition. But here's where the darkness deepens. When Sheriff Clayton Barnes uncovered Debbie's body in 1973 alongside the bones of forgotten men, he faced a truth his predecessors had avoided for generations. The town had been complicit. The evidence was undeniable. At least 7 victims, possibly more, the oldest dating back to the earliest years of the inn. Yet the records tell us something chilling. In the decades before Debbie, there had been sporadic rumors filed in the sheriff's ledgers, reports of missing salesmen, peddlers, travelers, cases marked closed, presumed runaway, not investigated, not followed. Paperwork became a coffin, official silence layered on top of communal silence, and still the inn stood. This is where we must strip away illusions. History is not just shaped by the powerful who act, but by the ordinary who choose not to act. And in this small Tennessee town, survival depended on keeping your head down. The Hadleys were odd, yes, but oddness was not a crime. Rumors swirled, yes, but rumors are not evidence, and so the silence was maintained. But silence feeds corruption like wood feeds fire. Over the years, as more bones piled beneath the floor, the town created its own mythology, ghost stories about travelers who never left, warnings to children to stay away. They wrapped the truth in legend because legend is safe. You can tell it around a fire, laugh nervously, and still walk home. Legend is easier to live with than reality. So when Debbie Lawson vanished in 1973, and her body was uncovered in that same soil, the legend snapped. The horror became undeniable. The skeletons were real. The myths had been truth all along. But the deeper question remains. How could this inn have functioned, not just as a crime scene, but as an institution of erasure for 70 years? How could so many vanish, and yet life go on? The answer is uncomfortable, but it is the same in every dark chapter of human history. People tolerate evil as long as it does not touch them directly. Until it does. Until Debbie Lawson. The silence that protected the Hadleys was not just fear, it was utility. Travelers were outsiders. They were expendable. Their deaths destabilized nothing in the town. Their absence cost no one comfort. And so the system held. The inn kept swallowing men, and the town kept telling itself the lies it needed to survive. This is how darkness roots itself, not in grand conspiracies alone, but in the quiet compromises of ordinary people. And when it is finally exposed, as it was in 1973, the shock is not that it happened. The shock is that it was allowed to happen for so long. The bones beneath the Peddlers' Inn are not just the remains of strangers. They are the remains of a culture of silence, a system that chose comfort over truth, and that system is older than the inn itself. The moment the floorboards gave way in 1973, revealing not just Debbie but the long-buried dead, the sheriff knew this was no ordinary case. Yet almost immediately the investigation faltered, not from lack of evidence, but from something older, something deeper, the grinding weight of institutions designed to protect themselves before protecting truth. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation arrived with cameras, gloves, evidence bags. For a brief flash, it seemed the case might rise into the national spotlight. Reporters came, microphones thrust forward, eager for blood-soaked headlines. Local girl found in murder house. Bones of forgotten travelers discovered. The story crackled across radios, newspapers, even the evening news. But then, something happened. The headlines cooled. The national press turned away. Why? Because 1973 was the year of Watergate. The year the country's attention was consumed by scandal at the highest level of power. Against the roar of Washington, a small-town cold case in Appalachia was background noise. The system swallowed the story, not with malice, but with indifference. And sometimes indifference is more dangerous than conspiracy. The local sheriff's office was unequipped. Their forensics were primitive, no DNA analysis, no digital records. Bones were boxed, photographed, labeled, and sent to storage. Fragments of clothing were catalogued, but without context they became nothing but fabric scraps in plastic bags. The most telling artifact was a pocket watch with initials etched inside, JT, but without a national missing persons database, those initials led nowhere. And then there was the handwritten note, the one that lured Debbie to her death. It was analyzed for fingerprints, but none were usable. The paper was cheap, common. The ink gave no trace, a breadcrumb pointing to nowhere. Here's the truth. Institutions bury crimes, nay, not only with lies, but with bureaucracy. The case was opened, filed, updated, filed again. Interviews were typed, photographs were logged, evidence was bagged, and then it was shelved. Stored in a basement in a cardboard box where it would wait for decades, a coffin of paper. But what about the Hadleys? Records proved Theodore and Constance owned the inn. Edward Hadley, their son, lived until 1968, 5 years before Debbie's murder. Could he have killed those early travelers? Yes. Could he have built the inn into a slaughterhouse? Likely. But could he have killed Debbie? Impossible. He was already in the ground. This paradox gave the authorities an excuse. If Edward was dead, then the case could not be solved. The Hadley family were convenient villains, ghosts on which to hang the older murders. But Debbie's death, that was harder. That required admitting someone in 1973, alive and present, had lured a girl to her death. That required looking beyond history and into the present. And that was something the sheriff's office could not risk without shattering the illusion of safety for the entire town. So the investigation split in two. The old bones were chalked up to history, unidentified travelers, respectfully buried under a stone that read, "Unknown travelers, rest in peace." A lid nailed on the past. Debbie's death remained officially unsolved, a cold case hanging in silence. The press faded. The bureaucrats moved on. The inn was fenced off. The town rebuilt its silence, this time under the banner of unsolved tragedy. And that silence was once again useful. It protected reputations. It preserved stability. It kept questions from spreading. But in that silence, something malignant pulsed. Because if Edward Hadley had been the butcher of travellers, who carried his shadow forward, who left the note for Debbie, who chose to resurrect the ritual in 1973 when he should have been nothing more than a ruin. The institutions had failed not because they could not find the truth, but because they chose not to look too deeply. That is the oldest trick of power: bury the body in paperwork and call the case closed. And yet, like the bones beneath the floor, truth does not stay buried forever. Murder by itself is chaos. A flash of rage, a theft of breath, a body dropped into earth. But what happened at the Peddlers' Inn was not chaos. It was repetition, pattern, ritual. Look closely. The bones beneath the floor were not scattered randomly. They were arranged in layers like the rings of a tree, the oldest skeletons deep, the newer ones closer to the surface. Time itself became part of the burial, as though each victim was not merely hidden, but stacked upon the last, forming a foundation of the forgotten. Among the artifacts, a pocket watch, a hair comb, a coin purse, each object carefully left, almost like offerings. Debbie's silver bracelet placed deliberately on her chest. These are not the marks of a careless killer. These are signatures, symbols. Someone wanted meaning carved into the silence. And this is where men like Edward Hadley step out of folklore and into something darker. Was he simply a murderer? Or was he fulfilling a role, carrying out a system that transcended his own will? A system that needed strangers to vanish, that needed their possessions to remain behind, as though to mark the transaction. Across history, violence is rarely random. It is ritualized. Ancient cultures offered sacrifices to gods in exchange for harvests. Medieval lords punished dissent with public execution to remind the living of their place. And in rural Tennessee, in the early 1900s, what better stage than a lonely inn to turn disappearance into a pattern that sustained control? Consider this: the peddlers were outsiders, men carrying goods, wealth, news of the outside world. If they vanished, no one in town lost a son, a brother, a husband. Their deaths destabilized nothing in the community. Instead, they reinforced a boundary. The message was clear: these mountains decide who leaves alive. That is ritual, not the chanting of priests, not the burning of incense. But the repetition of power through blood. The act of erasing those who did not belong again and again until it became tradition hidden beneath floorboards. When Debbie Lawson died in 1973, the placement of her bracelet was a signal. Whoever killed her wasn't improvising. They were echoing the past. They were performing a role in a ritual older than themselves. And this means something terrifying. The system had survived Edward Hadley. His death in 1968 did not end it. Someone picked up where he left off. Here is the psychology. Rituals are not bound to individuals. They are passed down, whispered, imitated. A son watches his father bury bones. A neighbor hears rumors and decides to continue. Even silence itself, the silence of a town, becomes part of the ritual, because by refusing to stop it, they sustain it. That is why these crimes matter more than murder. They reveal a truth hidden in plain sight. Power survives by repetition. Kill one man, and it is a crime. Kill the same way for 70 years, and it becomes tradition. The Peddlers' Inn was not just a place where travelers died. It was a theater of control, a stage where outsiders were erased, insiders were warned, and silence became the chorus that kept the performance alive. And here is the most chilling part. Rituals of power never stay locked in history. They adapt, they mutate, they survive the death of their original actors, which means when Debbie Lawson walked into that inn in 1973, she wasn't killed by a man alone. She was killed by a system, a ritual that outlived the Hadleys, a ritual waiting for its next victim. And the question is not whether that ritual has ended, but where it has moved. The genius of corruption is scale. At the smallest scale, it looks like a single act of violence. A man kills a traveler. A girl is lured to her death. The act seems contained, local, personal. But zoom out and you see the structure, the web of silence, complicity and ritual that makes the act possible. The Peddlers Inn is a perfect case study. It was not just a murder house. It was a mirror of larger systems. What happened in that quiet Tennessee Valley is the same pattern we see in empires, corporations, governments. The inn was simply the stage where the drama played out in miniature. Think about the parallels, expendable outsiders. The peddlers were chosen because they had no anchors in town. Their absence would not disturb the community, in the same way institutions exploit the weak, the poor, the migrant, those whose vanishing won't disrupt the machine. Ritualized erasure. The victims weren't simply killed, they were layered, their possessions left like markers. The Hadleys created continuity, a ritual of disposal that gave each death the weight of tradition. Institutions do the same. They bury scandals in paperwork, one file stacked on another, until the truth is hidden beneath decades of dust. Silence as complicity. Locals knew, authorities suspected, yet the system survived because people decided survival was easier than confrontation. This is the same logic that protects corrupt politicians, predatory corporations, and abusive churches. Everyone knows, but few act, and inaction is the strongest ally of corruption. Myth as camouflage. The town turned whispers into ghost stories. They transformed the truth into folklore because folklore doesn't demand justice. This is identical to how larger systems mask corruption with narratives, patriotism, religion, business as usual. When you wrap evil in story, people stop asking for proof. So the Peddlers Inn. N was never just an inn, it was a symbol of how corruption sustains itself through expendability, ritual, silence, and myth. And when Debbie Lawson's bracelet was placed on her chest in 1973, it wasn't just a murder, it was a message. The system was still alive. This is why the inn matters, because every community, every nation, every structure of power has its version of it. A place where outsiders are consumed, where silence is currency, where truth is buried under layers of time. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Systems of corruption do not vanish when exposed. Exposure is only the first crack. What follows is adaptation. After Debbie's death, the inn was boarded up, fenced, closed. The newspapers moved on. The town told itself the ritual had ended. But rituals once established are not so easily destroyed. They mutate. They find new hosts. If the inn was no longer available, the pattern would not die. It would simply shift. Which means Debbie's death was not closure. It was transmission. The system leapt from one generation to the next. The Hadleys were gone, but the shadow they cast remained. And the question is, who picked it up? Because history teaches us this. Corruption does not end when the corrupt die. It ends only when the silence breaks. And in this Tennessee town, silence was still the strongest voice. The Hadleys' bloodline seemed to end with Edward's death in 1968. But rituals are not bound by blood. They are bound by memory, imitation, and opportunity. Debbie Lawson's death proved that someone had stepped into the role. The question is, who? We begin with proximity. The inn stood abandoned after Edward's passing, its doors shuttered but never demolished. Locals whispered it was cursed, but curiosity is never so easily killed. Teenagers dared each other to enter. Wanderers broke in to sleep on the dusty floors, and in those years between 1968 and 1973, the building became something else, a stage waiting for the next performance. Investigators at the time suspected three possibilities. A relative. Though Edward had no surviving children, the Hadley family tree stretched outward. Cousins, nephews, distant kin, some still lived nearby. The logic was simple. Who else would feel entitled to carry on Edward's silent inheritance? Who else would know the secrets of the floorboards? An accomplice. Rituals rarely survive alone. Perhaps Edward had not been the sole butcher of travelers. Perhaps someone younger, quieter, had watched him work, assisted, dug graves, and when Edward's heart stopped, that apprentice carried the ritual forward. A mimic. Folklore is infectious. By the late 1960s, the town already traded ghost stories about the inn. Is it impossible that someone else, a local with darker impulses, decided to imitate the Hadleys? to cloak their own violence in the legend, using the inn as ready-made camouflage. Each possibility leads us deeper into the architecture of corruption, because whether family, accomplice, or mimic, the killer who took Debbie was not inventing something new. They were borrowing an existing ritual, plugging themselves into a system that had already normalized silence. And silence did the rest. The sheriff's records mention a man named J.T. Cobb Turner, grandson of Richard Turner, the handyman who once worked under Theodore Hadley. In 1973, Jacob was 27, a drifter, often seen near the inn. He was questioned briefly, then dismissed. No evidence, just whispers, and so his name was buried in the paperwork like all the others. There were also the Hadley cousins, distant relatives who lived just 2 ridges over. One, a reclusive farmer named Samuel Hadley, died in 1981. The other, Ruth Hadley, moved away in the late 70s. Both were rumored to avoid town gatherings, always keeping to themselves. Their names, too, never rose beyond rumor. And then there is the most unsettling theory of all, that Debbie's killer was not kin, not apprentice, not mimic, but town itself. That someone local, perhaps respected, decided to continue the ritual because it had always served a purpose. Outsiders vanish, insiders remain untouched. In this reading, the killer was not acting alone, but with the passive permission of everyone who chose not to look too closely. That is why Debbie's case was never solved. Not because evidence was absent, but because evidence was inconvenient. To solve her murder would mean admitting the town was still infected, that the ritual had never died. And for institutions and neighbors alike, it was easier to pretend Edward Hadley had taken the darkness with him to the grave. But the bracelet on Debbie's chest tells another story. The ritual was alive. The hand that placed it there was not Edward's, but it belonged to someone who understood the script. And that means the performance was still ongoing. When the inn was boarded shut after Debbie's death, outsiders believed the darkness had ended. The building was left to rot, its windows covered, its doors chained. But buildings do not contain corruption. People do, and people carry it forward. In the years after 1973, the town began to change. The inn no longer swallowed travelers, but the pattern remained. Silence, erasure, the quiet substitution of myth for truth, and soon the same mechanics that had protected the Hadleys began reappearing in new forms under new disguises. Consider this. In 1976, a migrant worker named Luis Ortega vanished. He had been picking tobacco in nearby fields. No one reported him missing, not in town, not in his home state. His belongings were later found abandoned near the river. The sheriff's report was brief, presumed runaway, the same phrase used for travelers half a century earlier. In 1982, a teenage boy was found drowned in a quarry. His friends swore he was a strong swimmer. The coroner listed the death as an accident. Case closed. The whispers that he'd been lured there never followed. By the mid-1980s, a pattern had emerged. People who lived on the margins, people who did not fit neatly into the community's image of itself, kept disappearing. A worker, a runaway, a drifter, always outsiders, always expendable. And each time the response was the same: paperwork silence and the slow burial of truth under official language. This is how rituals survive when their stage collapses. They migrate. The Peddlers' Inn was no longer the vessel, but the town itself had absorbed its logic. Outsiders still vanished, silence still protected insiders, and myth still masked reality. The mountains are dangerous, they would say. People get lost. Convenient stories told with the same nervous laughter that once accompanied ghost tales of the inn. Notice the mechanism, the stage shift. Ted, from floorboards to fields, rivers, quarries. The victims shifted from traveling peddlers to migrant workers, restless teenagers, drifters. The ritual stayed the same, outsiders erased, insiders silent. This is why the inn was never just about the Hadleys. It was about a system of control embedded in the community. When the inn closed, the system adapted, like a parasite finding a new host. The most chilling part is this. By the 1990s, the legend of the inn was firmly sealed as folklore. Tourists began to whisper about the murder house of Tennessee. Locals told the story at bonfires, stripping it of teeth. The past became entertainment, and in that distraction, the ongoing vanishings were forgotten. Folklore replaced accountability. The town buried its crimes twice, once beneath the inn and once beneath myth. And yet, the truth lingered in the cracks. Families of the vanished kept asking questions, files gathered dust in county basements, and occasionally someone would point out the uncomfortable fact. How many disappearances, how many accidents could one valley sustain before admitting that silence itself was the killer? The ritual had not ended in 1973. It had evolved, and its evolution was even more dangerous because it no longer needed the inn to contain it. The entire town had become its vessel. By the 1990s, the inn itself was nothing but a ruin. Collapsed beams, vines crawling through shattered windows, a husk. But the darkness it birthed no longer needed walls to contain it. It had migrated into institutions, and when corruption moves into institutions, it becomes nearly impossible to kill. Think about the sheriff's office. For decades, files on disappearances, drownings, and accidents stacked up, each one sealed with the same indifference. The reports were written in the same hand, using the same dismissive phrases. No signs of foul play, case closed, accidental death. The language itself became ritual. Paper became the new coffin. But was it incompetence or complicity? Consider Sheriff Roy Mitchell, the man who had replaced Barnes in the late 1970s. He inherited the Peddlers in-case file, read the interviews, saw the photographs. He knew the story better than anyone, yet in his 20 years as sheriff, not one of the unexplained vanishings was pursued as homicide. Why? Because to open one case was to tear open all of them, and to admit the pattern was to admit the town itself had been complicit for a century. Silence was safer, and it wasn't just law enforcement. By the early 2000s, local officials, landowners, and even pastors contributed to the erasure. A local preacher, when asked about the town's cursed history, smiled and said, "The Lord tests us in strange ways." A county commissioner, when pressed about missing persons, waved it off. Transient folks drift through. That's life in the mountains. Notice the language: spiritual distraction, bureaucratic minimization. Every word was designed to keep the truth submerged. The corruption of the inn had taken root in the very systems meant to protect. The sheriff's badge, the preacher's pulpit, the commissioner's office, all had become shields for silence. The ritual was now institutionally Z. And here is the dark genius of such corruption. It teaches the community to participate in its own erasure. Parents warned their children not to go near the inn, not because of what truly happened there, but because of ghost stories. The myth became a leash, keeping questions buried beneath superstition. Even skeptics avoided digging too deep, afraid of what they might find. But the past has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. In 2019, when Detective Sarah Mitchell stumbled upon the old files, she wasn't just opening a cold case, she was breaking the seal on a century-old covenant of silence. And every institution that had buried the truth trembled at the thought of what she might uncover. Because here's the lesson men rarely want to face. Corruption doesn't survive because evil men enforce it. It survives because ordinary men look away. It thrives on convenience, on comfort, on fear. The inn was only the birthplace. The town was the incubator. And by the time the new millennium dawned, the sickness had reached its full maturity. But a mature sickness is also vulnerable because it has grown too large to hide forever. Sarah Mitchell was stubborn by nature. She had grown up under the shadow of her grandfather, Deputy Roy Mitchell, who had searched for Debbie Lawson in the storm of 1973. He had died with regrets, convinced he had failed the girl and the truth. Sarah had sworn she would not carry the same burden, so when her superiors told her to back down, she did the opposite. She began running her own investigation quietly, off the books, nights in the courthouse basement flipping through brittle pages of tax rolls, mornings digging through coroner reports of accidental drownings and lost hikers, weekends tracing the Hadley descendants, building a family tree marked not just by births and deaths, but by disappearances in every decade. The deeper she went, the clearer the shape became. It wasn't random, it was patterned. A ritual of elimination disguised as happenstance. Outsiders always chosen, always erased in ways that looked natural, explainable. Drownings, runaways, accidents. Every file whispered the same truth. The ritual had adapted to modern eyes, but it had never stopped. But patterns this precise aren't just coincidence. Sarah began to suspect something more organized, something passed down not just by bloodline but by design. Old newspaper clippings hinted at secret meetings, fraternal lodges, gatherings where the Hadleys and their allies met, handshakes, oaths, and whispered vows. It was the architecture of a hidden order operating in plain sight beneath the mask of a small American town. And then the retaliation began. Her car was tampered with, brake lines nearly cut. She found her tires slashed outside her apartment one night. A stranger in a baseball cap followed her down a grocery aisle, but when she turned to confront him, he melted into the crowd. The message was clear: "We know what you're doing." Still, Sarah pressed on. She smuggled copies of the most damning files into a safe deposit box under an assumed name. She wrote out notes documenting her suspicions, her trail of evidence. If anything happened to her, she wanted others to know where to look. But she also knew she was playing a dangerous game, because this wasn't just about a family anymore. This was about an entire town that had learned to survive by silence. Exposing the ritual meant exposing every institution that had enabled it, every sheriff who closed a file, every coroner who wrote accident, every official who said, "Let sleeping dogs lie." Sarah wasn't just hunting a killer, she was threatening the survival mechanism of the town itself. And when you threaten survival, people lash out. The inn had been the stage. The town had been the incubator, but Sarah's investigation was the spark that could burn it all down, which meant the system, like a cornered animal, would soon bare its teeth. And if history was any guide, it would not hesitate to take another life to keep its silence intact. Sarah Mitchell was stubborn by nature. She had grown up under the shadow of her grandfather, Deputy Roy Mitchell, who had searched for Debbie Lawson in the storm of 1973. He had died with regrets, convinced he had failed the girl and the truth. Sarah had sworn she would not carry the same burden, so when her superiors told her to back down, she did the opposite. She began running her own investigation quietly, off the books, nights in the courthouse basement flipping through brittle pages of tax rolls, mornings digging through coroner reports of accidental drownings and lost hikers, weekends tracing the Hadley descendants, building a family tree marked not just by births and deaths, but by disappearances in every decade. The deeper she went, the clearer the shape became. It wasn't random, it was patterned. A ritual of elimination disguised as happenstance. Outsiders always chosen, always erased in ways that looked natural, explainable. Drownings, runaways, accidents. Every file whispered the same truth. The ritual had adapted to modern eyes, but it had never stopped. But patterns this precise aren't just coincidence. Sarah began to suspect something more organized, something passed down not just by bloodline but by design. Old newspaper clippings hinted at secret meetings, fraternal lodges, gatherings where the Hadleys and their allies met, handshakes, oaths, and whispered vows. It was the architecture of a hidden order operating in plain sight beneath the mask of a small American town. And then the retaliation began. Her car was tampered with, brake lines nearly cut. She found her tires slashed outside her apartment one night. A stranger in a baseball cap followed her down a grocery aisle, but when she turned to confront him, he melted into the crowd. The message was clear: "We know what you're doing." Still, Sarah pressed on. She smuggled copies of the most damning files into a safe deposit box under an assumed name. She wrote out notes documenting her suspicions, her trail of evidence. If anything happened to her, she wanted others to know where to look. But she also knew she was playing a dangerous game, because this wasn't just about a family anymore. This was about an entire town that had learned to survive by silence. Exposing the ritual meant exposing every institution that had enabled it, every sheriff who closed a file, every coroner who wrote accident, every official who said, "Let sleeping dogs lie." Sarah wasn't just hunting a killer, she was threatening the survival mechanism of the town itself. And when you threaten survival, people lash out. The inn had been the stage. The town had been the incubator, but Sarah's investigation was the spark that could burn it all down, which meant the system, like a cornered animal, would soon bare its teeth. And if history was any guide, it would not hesitate to take another life to keep its silence intact. The breakthrough came in the most unlikely place: an attic. Sarah had tracked down one of the last surviving Hadley relatives, a reclusive man in his 80s who lived alone in a decaying farmhouse outside Bristol. His name was Clarence Hadley, grandson of Edward. Clarence was frail, nearly blind, his voice a whisper of memory. He denied everything when asked about the inn, but Sarah noticed the way his hands shook when she mentioned Debbie Lawson's name. After he died only 2 weeks later, Sarah returned to the farmhouse under the guise of assisting with the estate. That's when she found the trunk in the attic, an iron-bound chest buried under moth-eaten quilts. Inside were journals, yellowed photographs, and something darker: trinkets, buttons, coins, scraps of jewelry, each one labeled in careful handwriting, dates scrawled beside them. They weren't keepsakes. They were trophies. One entry, written in Edward Hadley's hand around 1915, froze her blood. The inn feeds us. The road brings them. The floor accepts their weight. One less mouth upon the earth, one more layer beneath it. The circle remains unbroken. There it was. Proof that the killings were ritual, not random. Proof that the family had seen themselves not as murderers, but as guardians of some circle that demanded offerings. This wasn't madness. It was belief, structured, deliberate, rehearsed for generations. Even worse, later entries showed that when the inn was sold in 1920, the practice did not end. It simply moved locations: rivers, quarries, remote hollows. The language shifted slightly: the earth, the water, the stone, but the circle always remained unbroken. Sarah photographed everything. She knew she was holding evidence that could blow open the entire case. But when she tried to submit it, the resistance was immediate. Her captain dismissed the journals as family ramblings, the Seahecht. County clerk stalled the entry of the property into evidence. Even the state archivist politely refused her request to catalogue the material, citing chain of custody concerns. Doors slammed in her face at every level. The pattern was undeniable. The institutions were closing ranks. And then came the warning. A plain white envelope slipped under her office door. Inside was a single photograph: Debbie Lawson, taken from the original crime scene, her bracelet placed across her chest. On the back, 4 words written in block letters: "The circle remains unbroken." Sarah felt the message deep in her bones. This was no longer about history. This was about now. The keepers of the ritual were alive, watching, and willing to act. For the first time, Sarah realized she wasn't investigating the past. She was trespassing in a living system, one that had tolerated silence for decades but would kill to preserve itself. The Hadleys had been the beginning, but now the circle had widened, swallowing officials, neighbors, protectors, and Sarah had just painted a target on her back. The question was no longer whether the inn's secrets would surface. It was whether Sarah would survive long enough to tell them. Sarah Mitchell had always believed monsters wore masks. She thought they would be easy to spot if you looked close enough. Eyes too cold, smiles too forced, gestures just a little too rehearsed. But when she began knocking on the doors of Hadley descendants still living in Winston County, what she found was worse than monsters. She found ordinary people: church deacons, farmers, a retired postman, people whose faces you might pass in the grocery store without a second thought. It was in those faces that the true horror resided, the ordinariness of evil. Her first visit was to a middle-aged man named Richard Hadley, a mechanic who ran a small garage off the highway. He welcomed her with a smile, wiped the grease from his hands, and offered her a glass of water. But when she asked about the journals she had found in Clarence Hadley's attic, his expression did not falter. His voice didn't crack. Instead, he simply chuckled and said, "Old family stories. You know how folks in the mountains like to scare themselves." The words might have reassured another investigator, but Sarah saw the flicker in his eyes when she mentioned Debbie Lawson's name. The faintest twitch, almost imperceptible, like a shadow passing over his face. And then he leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough to press into her skin. Sometimes stories are safer left alone. It was not a threat. It was a confession disguised as advice. At the home of another descendant, an elderly woman named Margaret, Sarah found a Bible on the coffee table. Inside its cover was a handwritten note. "The circle is God's will. The earth requires balance." Margaret swore she had never seen the note before. She insisted it must have belonged to her late husband, but her hands trembled when she handed the book to Sarah. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "It never ended, you know. It only changed." Each encounter left Sarah with the same realization. This wasn't just a hidden crime. It was a belief system, a faith that had taken root across generations, and the keepers of that faith had woven themselves so seamlessly into the fabric of the town that exposing them would be like tearing the skin from the body. The deeper Sarah pressed, the bolder the responses became. A man in a feed store muttered under his breath as she passed, "Circle breakers don't last long." An anonymous caller left a message on her phone, heavy breathing, then a single word, "Unbroken." Even her colleagues grew colder, their greetings clipped, their eyes avoiding hers in the hallway. She was being isolated piece by piece. The system was circling her. One night, parked outside the ruins of the Peddlers Inn, she saw headlights appear in her rearview mirror. The vehicle stayed there for an hour, engine running, never moving closer, never pulling away. She sat in the darkness, hand on her gun, pulse hammering, and in that silence, she understood. They were not warning her anymore. They were watching her, measuring her resolve, deciding when and where to strike. The realization cut her deeper than fear. The circle was not history. It was present tense. These people had convinced themselves they were guardians of balance, and she, by daring to drag their secrets into the light, was not just an investigator. She was a transgressor, a violator of their covenant. Sarah's mentor once told her that corruption thrives because it hides behind masks of respectability. She saw it now in full clarity. These descendants didn't need to hide in shadows or basements. They stood in church pews. They sat on school boards. They handed out candy at Halloween. And behind every smile was the echo of that phrase, "The circle remains unbroken." What chilled her most was this: they did not act guilty. They acted chosen. The Sarah Clee was not just a family secret anymore. It had become a creed, and Sarah Mitchell had declared war on a creed that spanned over a century. Sarah Mitchell knew she needed more than journals, whispers, and genealogies. In a county where every official had learned to look away, paper wasn't enough. She needed something undeniable: bones, blood, bodies, evidence that could not be dismissed as superstition or family stories. The clue came from the journals she had photographed in Clarence Hadley's attic. One passage from 1978 caught her eye. "The quarry is deep and silent. The water swallows the unneeded. The circle demands both earth and stone." Sarah checked county records. The quarry had closed in 1975 after a fatal landslide. It was only 3 miles from the ruins of the inn. If the Hadleys had been disposing of victims after the inn shut down, the quarry would have been perfect. Deep water, unstable ground, zero oversight. She went at night. No backup, no warrant, just a flashlight and a pry bar. The place was a scar in the earth, jagged cliffs, rusted machinery, stagnant pools reflecting the moonlight. She followed the path down to where the water pooled darkest. That's where she saw it. A faint glint under the surface, like metal catching light. She stripped off her jacket, slipped into the freezing water, and dove. Her hand brushed something rough, wooden, half-rotted. She pulled it up and nearly dropped it. A small chest sealed with rusted nails. Inside were objects wrapped in oilcloth: a woman's watch, a leather belt, a child's hair ribbon, each tagged with a date. And beneath them, at the bottom of the chest, was something worse: a bone fragment, human. Her hands shook. This wasn't 100-year-old evidence. The oilcloth was still pliable. The most recent date tag read 2017. Sarah's heart hammered as she realized what she was holding: trophies of recent victims. This wasn't just history. This was active. The circle was still taking people, now. She photographed everything, bagged the items, and led the quarry. But as she climbed the path back to her car, she froze. At the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the sky, stood two figures, motionless, watching. They didn't speak. They didn't move closer. They simply stood there like sentinels. Sarah felt every instinct screaming at her to draw her weapon, but she kept climbing. When she reached the top, the ridge was empty. The figures had vanished. By the time she reached the road, her car had been moved, just a few feet forward. The door left ajar. Her glove compartment emptied onto the passenger seat. Someone had been inside. They'd left a single Polaroid on her dashboard. A photo of her, waist-deep in the quarry water, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, taken just minutes earlier. On the back, the same words again. The circle remains unbroken. Sarah drove off with shaking hands, heart in her throat. She had the evidence, real, physical proof. But now she understood the full gravity of what she had stepped into. The believers were organized, active, and watching her in real time. This wasn't a cold case anymore. This was a war, and she had just declared it by pulling the first body from the water. Sarah Mitchell didn't sleep the night she pulled the chest from the quarry. She spread its contents across her kitchen table under a single lamp, photographing every item from multiple angles. The watch, the belt, the ribbon, the bone fragment, cleaner, fresher than it should have been, and the tags, always the tags. They weren't trophies, they were records. A log of offerings. 2017 was the latest. That wasn't history. That was a crime scene still echoing. By morning, she had organized her files into a binder 3 inches thick. DNA swabs, photographs of Clarence Hadley's journals, maps of the quarry and other suspected disposal sites. She even printed out the Polaroid someone had taken of her the night before, proof she was being stalked. She walked into the sheriff's office and placed the binder on Captain Given's desk. "This is active," she said. "Not cold, not folklore, active. We've got a serial pattern spanning a century, and it didn't stop with the inn. It's still happening." Givens didn't even open the binder. He stared at her for a long time, jaw tight, fingers laced together. "Sarah," he said finally, voice flat, "do you have any idea what you're accusing people of?" "I'm accusing them of murder," she snapped. "Murder and cover-ups. And you know what? If you won't take this upstairs, I will." Givens leaned forward, his face darkening. "You think you're the first person to dig around in these stories? You think you're the first to come waving papers and bones? Let me tell you something. This county has a way of handling its own. Always has, always will. And you'd better start thinking very carefully about how far you're going to push this before it breaks you." For the first time, Sarah saw it plainly. The captain wasn't just obstructing out of cowardice or political fear. He was in on it. Maybe not as a killer, but as a keeper, a protector of the circles. She snatched up her binder and walked out without another word. That night, she drove to the nearest state police outpost 2 counties over. She handed the binder to a young trooper she'd never met before, telling him only, "If something happens to me, this goes straight to the Attorney General." The trooper's eyes widened when he flipped through the pages. "Is this real?" he whispered. "It's as real as it gets," she said. "And they know I have it." When she returned home, her apartment door was ajar. Inside, nothing had been stolen, but everything had been moved. Drawers left open, pictures tilted, clothes folded into strange patterns on the bed. A message without words. "We were here." On her kitchen counter sat a mason jar filled with murky water. At the bottom, a single tag floated. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Hadley script. The tag read simply, 2023. It wasn't a warning. It was a placeholder, a new entry waiting for a name. Hers. Sarah felt her stomach drop. This wasn't a game of exposure anymore. This was a countdown. The believers had made her the next offering. But she wasn't going to run. She was going to burn the circle to the ground, even if it burned her with it. Sarah Mitchell had reached the point where fear became fuel. It wasn't courage, it was a hard, icy clarity. She knew now that she couldn't fight this like a cop, warrants, subpoenas, internal memos. Those were toys of the same system that had protected the Hadleys for a century. She had to step outside the frame. She went back to the journals. For days she studied Clarence Hadley's handwriting, his diagrams of hidden rooms, his obsessive notations. Each entry wasn't just a record of the kills, it was a blueprint for the rituals. Certain symbols drawn in the margins weren't decorative, they were timestamps, coded instructions about when and where the circles were supposed to meet. 2 nights later, she drove out to the quarry again, this time parking her car miles away and walking the rest of the distance under a moonless sky. In her backpack was a motion-triggered camera, a body mic and a flash drive containing copies of every piece of evidence she'd gathered, pre-scheduled to upload to multiple journalists if she didn't deactivate it by sunrise. She reached the pit's edge and crouched low. Below, faint light glowed. Torches, not flashlights. She counted 6 figures, men and women both. No robes, no masks, just normal clothing and a terrible casualness. They were placing objects into a newly dug trench, old personal effects, worn-out shoes, a child's toy. She recognized one of the men instantly. Captain Givens. Sarah's heart pounded, but she stayed still. Her camera caught everything. She zoomed in and snapped frame after frame. The voices drifted upward, indistinct but rhythmic, like a prayer without words. At the end, they all stepped back. One of them tossed a tag into the trench. Then they covered it with gravel. She waited until they left. Then she went down. The trench was shallow and fresh. At the bottom lay a burlap sack. She pulled it open with trembling hands, and found nothing living. Just a bundle of documents. Inside was a list of names with dates stretching from 1903 to the present. The ledger of every offering, every traveler who never left. Some of the names she recognized from missing person bulletins. Others were so old they had to be ghosts on paper. And at the bottom of the ledger was a single blank line under the year 2023. That's when she understood. This wasn't just a cult preserving history. It was a machine that had learned to sustain itself, generation after generation, always pulling in outsiders, always covering its tracks with the same precision. The Peddlers' Inn was just the nursery of the infection. The quarry was its cathedral. She took everything she could carry, sealed the trench as best she could, and left before dawn. Back in her car, she started the upload sequence. The files raced into the cloud. News outlets, independent investigators, bloggers who specialized in dark history. If she disappeared, the story would still live. But she wasn't going to disappear quietly. She was going to make them look at her. She was going to drag the circle into daylight on her terms. She drove straight to a public library in a neighboring county, logged into a burner account, and posted an anonymous drop of the photos and documents on multiple forums. She added one sentence at the end: "The Hadley Circle still breathes. Watch the quarry." Within hours, the post began to spread. Conspiracy boards, true crime subreddits, local journalists, people who'd spent years trading ghost stories about the Peddlers' Inn suddenly had evidence, photographs, maps, ledger pages. Sarah sat in her car outside the library as the first comments rolled in. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were dry. She knew what she had unleashed. She had taken a century of shadows and thrown them into the sun. But she also knew the circle wouldn't retreat quietly. They had survived the Depression, the wars, Watergate, the internet. They had lawmen, businessmen, judges. They would come for her now. The morning after the leak, the world had changed. Sarah woke to dozens of missed calls and hundreds of notifications. Her anonymous drop about the Hadley Circle had already been mirrored on thousands of servers. True crime podcasts were planning emergency episodes. Journalists were emailing for interviews. Someone on a conspiracy forum had already identified Captain Givens from the photos. But it wasn't applause she felt. It was a weight. She knew exactly how these people operated. Not with public statements, but with quiet retribution. At 9 a.m., she received a text from an unknown number. "You've made a mistake. This isn't a story. This is a sentence. You're next." She drove straight to her grandmother's old cabin on the edge of the Appalachians, a place with no cell service, no cameras. She wasn't running. She was repositioning. She set up 3 perimeter cameras, motion sensors, and a single landline to a state investigator she trusted. Then she loaded her shotgun. At noon, her burner email pinged, a video attachment. She opened it. It was a grainy clip of her apartment. Inside, someone walking slowly from room to room, humming an old Appalachian hymn. They never showed their face. At the end of the video, the camera panned down to her kitchen counter. Another mason jar, another tag. This one read, "Identity forfeited." Sarah closed the laptop, her heartbeat hammering. This wasn't fear anymore. It was fury. She wasn't just going to expose them. She was going to dismantle them. She drove back into town under a false name and rented a small office above an antique store. Inside, she set up what looked like an ordinary laptop, but was in fact a bait device. She posted a second leak, this time including incomplete evidence and a false address for additional records. It was a honey trap. If the Circle was watching, they would come for it. 3 days passed. She bartos. Eli slept. At night she read and reread Clarence Hadley's coded journals, looking for patterns in the rituals, trying to predict their moves. One night, staring at a page filled with odd symbols, she finally saw it, a set of dates and coordinates forming a spiral. At the center was a single location, the ruins of the Peddlers Inn. The next entry was scheduled for the following night. Sarah knew what they were planning. It wouldn't be a ritual in the quarry, it would be a return to the birthplace, the old inn, one last offering before disappearing forever into the soil. She armed herself. 2 hidden cameras, a small drone, a GPS tracker. She also called her one ally at the state level, a young investigator named Marcus Lane, and left a voicemail with the coordinates. "If you don't hear from me by sunrise," she said, "send everyone." That night she drove to the Peddlers Inn ruins. The road was empty. The building loomed like a skeleton against the sky, its signs swinging on a single nail just as the stories had described. She parked a mile away and walked in silence, the crunch of gravel under her boots, the only sound. Inside the inn she found fresh candles arranged in a circle. In the center lay a small, neat pile of belongings, a silver charm bracelet, a belt buckle, a faded photograph. She felt the breath leave her lungs. They weren't just honoring their past victims, they were staging a message for her. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned slowly. Captain Givens was standing in the doorway, but he wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a plain coat, his badge nowhere in sight. "You should have left it alone," he said quietly. "You don't know what this is." "Oh, I know exactly what this is," she said, leveling her weapon at him. "It's over." But as she spoke, 2 more figures stepped out of the shadows behind him. The Circle had come home. The air inside the inn tightened like a noose. Captain Givens' face was a map of fatigue and conviction. The others, neighbors, churchgoers, men with grease under their nails, stood like judges. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, but the weapon felt small against the centuries of silence that rose in the room. Givens spoke first, low and methodical. "You think you can unmake what we steward? You think your files and your cameras change blood?" His voice carried the weight of a man who had been protecting a lie so long it had become his faith. Around him, the Circle's members nodded as if to a prayer. She didn't argue. She had no words that would pierce that kind of conviction. Instead, she moved, fast, precise, trained. Givens lunged, a flinch born of habit, and the 2 around him surged. The first shove sent her against a splintered post. The second man's hand sought her shoulder like a vice. She twisted, elbowed, and felt the hollow crack of ribs against wood where her boot found a brace. Pain flared, but focus sharpened. Outside, someone shouted, then silence as feet pounded on gravel. Her camera recorded everything. The struggle, the confession of faces, the ritual masks falling away into plainness. She heard whispering, not pleading, but logistics, names crossed off, rituals affirmed. She realized with a cold sting that they had rehearsed this confrontation, prepared contingencies for exposure. They expected a martyr. They had been ready to make one. A chair snapped. A candle guttered and flamed the page of a journal. In the clash, something small and metallic skittered across the floor. The silver charm bracelet Debbie had worn decades ago, misplaced until now, gleaming like an accusation. Given's eyes flicked to it, and for a breath, his composure slipped. In that opening, Sarah struck, not to take a life, but to end the performance. A precise disarm, a call into, her phone that had been routed to the state investigator she'd warned. Voices rose from outside, sirens, improbable and sweet. The circle faltered, a creature startled into cowardice. Men who had believed themselves eternal found themselves ordinary and naked under the lamplight. Given's jaw worked. He mouthed the phrase Sarah had heard in every threat, every tag. Unbroken. The word landed in the room like a verdict, but the sirens grew louder, and the ritual's future, until that moment inevitable, now trembled on the edge of being stopped for good. Blue and red lights cut across the broken windows of the Peddlers Inn, flooding the ritual circle with something older than the Hadley's power. Law, daylight, exposure. Sarah held her ground, chest heaving, shotgun steady as the first troopers poured through the doorway. The men who had stood so tall in the shadows shrank back, hands raised or fists trembling with rage. Captain Givens was the last to move. His eyes stayed locked on Sarah's, lips curled in a thin smile. "You think the ledger ends tonight? You think truth kills bloodlines?" His voice cracked, but the defiance was real. He didn't fight when the cuffs bit his wrists. He didn't need to. He believed the circle lived beyond him. Sarah let the weight of the moment sink in. The journals, the bones, the tags, the bracelet now clutched in her hand. She felt the echo of every traveler silenced in this place. Their absence was heavy, but their story was no longer buried. That was the break. That was the fracture. The state troopers pulled the prisoners out one by one. Cameras clicked, radios chattered. Sarah exhaled for the first time in days. She knew the trials ahead would be messy. Politics, excuses, whispers of conspiracy theories. Some names would escape, some truths buried again under bureaucracy. But the silence was broken. Standing in the ruin of the inn, Sarah spoke not to the officers, not to Givens, but to the walls themselves. The ledger is closed. Outside, dawn bled across the horizon, washing the hills in pale gold. For the first time in over a century, the inn wasn't a tomb. It was a crime scene, open to the world, its secrets no longer safe. The Hadley Circle had endured generations, but tonight its shadow ended, and with that ending came something far more dangerous to every hidden hand in history: exposure,